Welcome to the end of the year Atlantic Council GeoEconomics Center video, where we talk about the hot topics we saw this year and how the GeoEconomics Center worked on them or addressed them. Charles, I want to start with you because I want to talk about Russia's reserves and related sanctions since I know you've done some work on this. The front page of the Financial Times just reported that the West is moving closer to seizing Russia's reserves and devoting them to the reconstruction in Ukraine. But I thought Europe was against this and had an alternative proposal. So can you explain what's going on and if there's precedent for this?
Yes, Agar, happy holidays. Happy to be here. There is not really any precedent for something on this scale. Russia's reserves, those of the reserves that were kept in the West, just over $300 billion, have been immobilized since just after the 24th of February, the beginning of the fully fledged invasion of Ukraine. We now know with confidence that Russia has not been able to touch these or move them under different guises and alliances. But there has been a debate, a growing debate on what to do with them. Most of them have accumulated in Europe, not in the US or in the UK. But funnily enough, it is the US and the UK who most recently have been pushing for simply seizing the money and putting it in a fund for Ukraine. The Europeans are more skeptical because the precedent affects them first and foremost. Most of the money is there. And also they're a little bit worried about what the precedent means and whether other countries will trust the Eurozone in the long term for keeping some of their huge value that sometimes they have to keep as part of reserve management. So that's what's going on. When the FT said that the West was moving closer, I think there's an element of US and UK pressure on the Europeans to do it. Why do I say there isn't much of a precedent for this? During the first Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, there was a very different international community then and a lot more consensus. And so all the countries on the Security Council of the UN signed up to take all of the money that Iraq made during that war and devote that to the reconstruction of Kuwait. So reserves simply accumulated during the war were given to Kuwait. It was a very, very self-contained measure, not something that could be retroactive and look at all of the reserves Russia has accumulated over the previous decades. So two reasons why there isn't really a precedent for this. It was a much more small conservative measure, and there was also consensus for it in the UN Security Council. There obviously won't be for that this time.
Fascinating. Amazing that there hasn't really been precedent for taking blocked reserves and then devoting it to something else, something new that to a different country, a different effort. I'll be curious to see what happens. I want to shift the conversation to the question of de-dollarization or the dollar's dominance. Maya, I'm excited because I know that your team just launched a tracker that basically looks at dollar dominance, which is especially interesting given efforts we saw this year by China and the BRICS countries, for example, to create and expand an anti-West coalition and to undermine the power of the dollar. So can you explain what this tracker is and why you and your team decided to do this now?
Hi, Hagar. Always nice to see you. And yes, you're right. We do have some exciting news at GeoEcon. Last week, we launched this new Atlantic Council tracker called Dollar Dominance Monitor, which essentially looks at what are the sources of the dollar dominance and why dollar tends to be this preferred currency for trade and reserves, but at the same time analyzes whether there are any threats to it coming out of alternative currencies and alternative payment systems. So the reason why we are interested in those questions right now, so there are two reasons. The first one is the BRICS, as you mentioned. In the summer, they had a summit. So these countries called, BRICS, India, or the BRICS, the grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they have been very active in promoting this de-dollarization initiatives, and they have even come up with the idea of launching their own currency. On a collective level, they have been pretty unsuccessful in that, but we do believe that it's still very interesting and important to monitor because together these BRICS currencies share more than 30% of global GDP. So that is the reason we are interested in that specific grouping, and we will be monitoring in the tracker very closely. The second reason is this potential connection between financial sanctions and de-dollarization. it's not the first time that experts are interested whether financial sanctions are causing de-dollarization, and they are sort of forcing countries to explore some non-dollar alternatives to sanction-proof their economies. This question was popular back in 2014, and now that in 2022 sanctions were imposed against Russia at an unprecedented scale, this question came back, and we decided it was a good time to explore because since 2022 we've been seeing a lot of reports about countries signing agreements to trade in national currencies, and a lot of times those reports are followed by very alarmist takes on dollar dominance and threats to dollar dominance. So we decided to take a data-driven approach to this issue, and present indicators, and basically two very very short findings based on our analysis is that there is no threat to dollar dominance or dollar's role as a global reserve currency in the near to medium term. However, in the long term we do need to pay attention to the rise of alternative payment infrastructures, and especially whether China manages to export its financial system to the world. So that's the framework we've developed so far, and we are monitoring, and everyone watching us right now can actually check out Atlantic Council Dollar Dominance Tracker, and we are always happy to hear feedback, and we will be working a lot on this project and improving it in the months coming ahead.
Well, you've made this at the perfect time because, as you said, this is really something, a trend that we're seeing develop even further. And you touched on China, which is a great segue to my next guest to talk to Niels about China's economic weakness. Niels, a theme throughout this year has been China's economy and how it has fared after its COVID zero policy and how that could affect the global economy. You've done a lot of the work on this, so I'm hoping you can explain why so many people are pessimistic about the Chinese economy and what you expect in the coming year.
Thanks, Gar, and happy to talk about China. So maybe taking one step back and thinking about kind of how people were thinking about China at the start of the year. Folks are so optimistic, after 2-3 years of zero COVID, China had finally ripped off the Band-Aid and was allowing economic activity back into its country at full scale. So I think a lot of folks were predicting the Chinese economy was going to come roaring back. Consumers were going to start to spend. We'd see the same sort of V-shaped recovery that we saw in economies like the US and the EU. But over the course of the year, that really did not pan out. By the time we got to June, July, it was increasingly clear that the Chinese economy was having real structural problems. A lot of people pointing specifically to consumer confidence and sort of consumer spending overall. And while it's certainly right to focus on consumer confidence and consumer spending, sometimes narrowing in just into that almost misses the forest for the trees. This is because on top of that, there are these large structural dynamics that were happening within China's economy long before COVID, long before China implemented zero COVID policies. We saw a lot of these coming to bear this year as China ripped it off. So, for example, we had the property sector continue to stagnate, continue to weigh on growth, and this also then impacted consumer confidence. Me as a family, I'm not going to spend on large capital expenditures, things like refrigerators, washing machines, buying new property, making new investments, if I'm not sure what the long-term health of my economy is going to be. So all these factors combined didn't allow consumer growth to become the sort of core driver that a lot of folks were expecting. So instead, China had to pivot to other areas. And this is what we're seeing right now with China increasing lending to its manufacturing sector in particular. China's looking now to export its way out of its low growth sort of stagnation. The question is whether the rest of the world will accept it, whether countries like the US, EU, Japan, and so forth will take on an increasing share of Chinese goods as China aims to kind of export its growth abroad. So that's the kind of core question that we're going into 2024 with.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Niels. And a great way to wrap up. These were the hot topics that we saw here at the GeoEconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. I'm Hagar Shamali, and I want to wish you all a happy holiday and a happy new year.